Translation technology, the great equalizer of interstellar politics, had become so seamlessly integrated into galactic society that most species forgot it even existed. Much like oxygen to humans or methane to the flatulent vorlex, it was simply there, enabling the grand farce of diplomacy to stumble along with minimal misunderstandings. Of course, minimal misunderstandings in galactic politics still meant the occasional vaporization of a moon or minor extinction event, but nobody's perfect. 97% accuracy rating boasted the advertisements for the latest QT9000 neural translator. The fine print, readable only to the compound-eyed hextopians, mentioned something about the remaining 3% being statistically insignificant, except during peace negotiations, mating rituals, or restaurant orders. What the ads failed to mention was the carefully programmed linguistic hierarchy encoded into every device, a digital caste system that nobody questioned because, well, questioning things was so terribly uncivilized. At the apex of this hierarchy perched the Kreshner, whose 72 tonal variations could convey an entire peace treaty in what sounded to human ears like someone strangling a melodic cat. At the bottom languished humanity, whose languages were considered so embarrassingly straightforward that several xenolinguists had built entire careers around papers with titles like Homo sapiens communication, advanced grunting, or elaborate mime. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps, an organization whose bureaucracy was so labyrinthine that 3 species had gone extinct while waiting for travel visa approvals, maintained this hierarchy with the zealotry of accountants who'd discovered a tax loophole. Their headquarters, a gleaming monstrosity of impossible architecture that hovered above the neutral planet Concordia, housed thousands of diplomats, tens of thousands of assistants, and approximately 1 million coffee machines. The concept of coffee being perhaps humanity's only respected contribution to galactic culture. The annual multi-species summit approaches, announced First Order Zuchtral of the GDC, his voice emerging from 7 different orifices simultaneously, which the QT9000 helpfully translated while filtering out the accompanying odors. This year's agenda includes 37 species, 14 territorial disputes, 9 trade agreements, and 1 human delegation that we're all going to pretend to take seriously. Polite tittering, ranging from subsonic rumbles to ultrasonic squeals, rippled through the assembly hall. Mocking humans had become something of a sport among the senior diplomatic corps. Their planet was unremarkable, their lifespan laughably brief, their technology primitive enough that they still occasionally had to physically touch their computers like animals. The fact that they'd achieved faster-than-light travel with what amounted to duct tape and optimism was generally regarded as a statistical anomaly rather than ingenuity. What made humans truly insufferable, however, was their inexplicable resilience. They'd survived 3 different encounters with the Hive Collective that should have ended them. They'd established colonies on planets that more advanced species had deemed uninhabitable. They'd even managed to negotiate surprisingly favorable trade terms despite their low status, through what the Kreshnar ambassador had described as an utterly undignified willingness to endure humiliation without holding grudges. This year's summit has particular importance, continued Ziggy Cottrell, his primary speaking orifice pulsating with gravitas, while his secondary ones handled the more nuanced grammatical flourishes. The discovery of the ruins on Nexus 4 has elevated tensions among several key member species. Ah, yes, the ruins, the galaxy's latest obsession. Discovered beneath the northern polar region of a contested planet, the sprawling underground complex predated all known civilizations by at least 50,000 years. The architecture was unlike anything in the archaeological record, featuring impossible angles and materials that shouldn't exist according to current understanding of physics. But most tantalizing of all were the inscriptions, flowing, intricate symbols carved into every surface, in a language that had thus far resisted all attempts at translation. Preliminary analysis suggests these may be remnants of the precursors themselves, added Second Order Ethvik, her bioluminescent appendages flashing in patterns that conveyed excitement beyond what mere words could express. The QT9000 added little sparkle emojis to her translated statement, a feature that everyone agreed was unnecessary but nobody knew how to disable. The precursors, the mythical first spacefaring civilization that supposedly seeded the galaxy with the building blocks of sentient life before mysteriously vanishing. Most serious scientists dismiss them as legend, a convenient explanation for evolutionary similarities across diverse planetary systems. But the ruins on Nexus 4 had given new life to old myths, and suddenly everyone wanted a piece of the planet and its secrets. The Archivist Guild has officially declared the language untranslatable, stated Third Orator Keb Rowe, his crystalline form refracting light in a way that the translator interpreted as profound disappointment. Even with our most advanced algorithms and the combined linguistic knowledge of the galactic database, we have been unable to decipher a single phrase. This announcement triggered a cascade of responses: dismay from the scientists, strategic calculation from the military representatives, and barely concealed glee from the real estate developers already planning luxury condos with authentic precursor views. Regardless, Sutral resumed, his dominant voice drowning out the chatter, ownership of Nexus 4 must be resolved at the summit. The Archaeological Council demands unrestricted access. The trading conglomerate has existing mining claims, and 3 different species insist the planet falls within their ancestral territories. "Don't forget the humans," interjected a voice from the back, triggering another wave of amused sounds. "They have a research outpost on the southern continent and are insisting on representation in all planetary discussions, as per Galactic Charter subsection whatever." "Indeed," sighed Zugtrell, all 7 of his speaking organs deflating simultaneously. "The humans will be there, though what they hope to contribute beyond comical misunderstandings is beyond my comprehension." What nobody in that gleaming hall of power realized, what nobody could possibly have predicted, was that the upcoming summit would completely rewrite the established order of the galaxy, and that the species they had relegated to the bottom of their precious hierarchy was about to climb to the top with such spectacular swiftness that several diplomats would later require therapy for status vertigo. But that was still 3 standard days away. For now, the GDC continued its preparations, blissfully unaware that they were arranging the stage for their own obsolescence. They debated seating arrangements with the gravity normally reserved for disarmament treaties, argued over the menu with the ferocity of territorial disputes, and completely failed to notice that the human delegation had requested one unusual accommodation: a specialist in ancient terrestrial languages. A request that had been approved without question because nobody thought to ask why. After all, what possible relevance could extinct human languages have at a summit concerning the untranslatable symbols of a civilization that predated all known species by millennia? The arrogance of the established order was about to meet its match in humanity's most overlooked quality: a knack for connecting seemingly unrelated dots into patterns that nobody else could see. And in 3 days' time, those connections would redraw the map of power across the stars. The arrival of diplomatic vessels to Concordia was a spectacle that combined the pomposity of a royal coronation with the barely concealed aggression of a sporting event. Each ship was designed to broadcast its species' superiority through whatever metrics they deemed important: size, aesthetics, technological advancement, or in the case of the gaseous collective, the ability to change the local atmospheric composition simply by their presence. The Kreshnar delegation arrived in what could only be described as a cathedral that had intimate relations with a battleship, producing a hybrid monstrosity of soaring spires and enough weaponry to vaporize a small moon. For defensive purposes only, their advanced communications stated, though the definition of defensive apparently included targeting systems that locked onto every other vessel within a 3-parsec radius. "Compensating for something, aren't they?" Muttered a traffic controller as the massive ship maneuvered into position with a precision that somehow managed to be smug. The Chloridian ship resembled an enormous floating greenhouse, radiating enough artificial sunlight to give nearby vessels sensor arrays the equivalent of a sunburn. The Vorlex arrived in what appeared to be a mobile gas giant fragment, perpetually shifting between various nauseating shades of brown and orange. The Hextopians came in a fractal pattern vessel that hurt the eyes if viewed for more than 3 seconds, a feature that their spokesperson insisted was merely aesthetic, despite the documented cases of seizures among customs officials. Each arrival followed the same pattern: ostentatious approach, formal communication bursting with flowery diplomatic language and subtle threats, and ceremonial docking procedures that had been choreographed down to the nanosecond. The orbital space around Concordia quickly came to resemble an overcrowded parking lot at a convention for architectural abominations. And then came the humans. Their ship, if one could dignify it with such a term, resembled nothing so much as a utilitarian brick with engines attached as an afterthought. Its hull bore the scars of micrometeorite impacts and hasty repairs. The vessel's name, Practical Solution, was emblazoned on the side in plain lettering that lacked even the courtesy of proper illumination. Human vessel approaching docking bay 17, announced the traffic control AI with what sounded suspiciously like relief. No special requirements, no ceremonial approach, no diplomatic flourishes. Estimated docking time, 7 minutes. Probability of incident, 3%. The gathered diplomatic attachés watched with a mixture of amusement and second-hand embarrassment as the human ship executed a perfectly adequate but thoroughly unimpressive docking maneuver. No flair, no demonstration of technical prowess, just the bare minimum required to safely connect to the station. They really don't understand the concept of making an entrance, do they? Observed a junior Kreshner diplomat, all three of his eyes blinking in synchronized disdain. Perhaps they're saving their energy for making an exit, which I sincerely hope will be sooner rather than later, replied his superior, triggering the translator's sarcasm indicators. The human delegation that emerged from the airlock consisted of 5 individuals dressed in what passed for formal attire on their planet, variations on the inexplicably persistent suit concept that they had been wearing for centuries with only minor modifications. Most species updated their ceremonial garments at least every decade to reflect evolutionary or philosophical developments. Humans apparently had decided that black fabric tubes for the legs and torso represented the pinnacle of fashion. 4 of the humans were typical specimens, unremarkable in every way, except perhaps for the quiet competence with which they carried themselves. The 5th, however, drew curious glances even from species who normally couldn't distinguish one human from another. This individual was notably older, with a mane of white hair that defied the normal constraints of their species' grooming practices. Instead of the standard diplomatic attire, they wore what appeared to be layers of comfortable worn fabric adorned with incomprehensible patterns. Most peculiar of all was the ancient physical book clutched in gnarled hands, an object so archaic that several younger diplomats had to access their neural databases to identify it. "Welcome to Concordia," intoned the reception officer, a gelatinous being whose translucent form rippled with the official colors of the GDC. "Your delegation has been assigned quarters in the Auxiliary Diplomatic Wing, Section 27B. The preliminary reception begins in 3 standard hours. Do you require basic translation assistance or cultural orientation?" The lead human stepped forward with a smile that somehow managed to be both deferential and slightly amused. "No translation assistance required, thank you. We've all been fitted with the latest QT9000 models." Left unmentioned was the fact that humans were among the few species who bothered to learn other languages despite having translators, a quirk that was generally attributed to their excessive free time due to short lifespans. As the human delegation was escorted to their quarters, located, coincidentally, right next to the waste reclamation system, the grand reception hall was undergoing its final preparations. A space designed to accommodate beings ranging from microscopic swarm intelligences to 30-meter silicon-based giants required architectural flexibility that bordered on the surreal. Gravity plates allowed for 13 different gravitational preferences. Atmosphere bubbles maintained the precise gaseous compositions needed by various respiratory systems, and temperature zones ranged from near absolute zero to the surface temperature of a Class M dwarf star. The preliminary reception, a name that suggested the existence of several more receptions of increasing importance, began with a ceremony that was simultaneously so tedious and so fraught with potential diplomatic pitfalls that most attendees were in a state of high anxiety disguised as boredom. First orator Zukustral performed the ritual of mutual recognition, a 40-minute speech delivered in the ancient diplomatic language of the founding species. The fact that nobody, including the founding species themselves, fully understood this language anymore was considered irrelevant. Tradition was tradition. The humans arrived exactly on time, a faux pas in galactic diplomatic circles, where fashionable lateness was calculated on a complex sliding scale based on species importance. Being precisely punctual was considered either a subtle insult or evidence of pathological literalism. "Ah, the Earth delegation," announced a protocol officer with the precise tone of someone acknowledging the arrival of a mildly contagious but non-fatal disease. "How efficient of you to join us exactly at the stated time." The lead human diplomat, whose name badge identified them as the chief negotiator, in a display of linguistic simplicity that made several Kreshnar wince, offered a bland smile. "We're eager to participate in these important discussions." "Yes, well, your enthusiasm is noted," replied the officer, already turning away to greet a genuinely important delegation. The first day of any summit followed an established pattern, familiar to all but the most inexperienced diplomats. Beneath the veneer of ceremony and polite conversation, the real work was happening. Alliances were being assessed, weaknesses probed, leverage points identified. It was a dance as old as diplomacy itself, though performed by beings whose evolutionary paths had diverged billions of years ago. The humans, to their credit, appeared to understand the game even if they played it poorly. They circulated through the reception, engaging in conversations that invariably began with condescension from the other party, followed by mild surprise that the humans could maintain coherent dialogue, and concluding with patronizing encouragement, the diplomatic equivalent of patting a child on the head for correctly identifying a primary color. "We understand your species has a research outpost on Nexus 4, said a Chloridian representative, her leaves rustling in what the translator identified as polite disbelief. "Yes, a small facility studying the planet's unusual magnetic field properties," replied the human negotiator. "We established it before the ruins were discovered." "How fortunate for you," the Chloridian's leaves, now conveying skepticism with undertones of amusement. "And now you find yourselves accidentally positioned on perhaps the most significant archaeological site in galactic history." "Lucky coincidence," agreed the human with a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Indeed, though I wonder what possible contribution your developing scientific capacity could offer to the analysis of such advanced artifacts." The older human with the wild white hair, who had thus far remained silent at the periphery of most conversations, suddenly spoke up, their voice carrying the particular resonance of someone who has spent decades in lecture halls. "Sometimes fresh eyes see patterns that experts miss precisely because they're experts." The Chloridian's leaves stiffened in what might have been offense, or simply the air conditioning adjusting to a new atmospheric zone. "A charming philosophy. Is that a human aphorism?" "Actually, it's a direct quote from Dr. Zvu Kresh of the Kreshner Archaeological Academy," replied the older human mildly. "I had the pleasure of attending his symposium on blind spots in expert analysis about 15 of your cycles ago." Before the Chloridian could formulate a response to this unexpected display of specific knowledge, the ceremonial chimes announced the transition to the formal opening of the summit. Delegations began moving toward the Grand Assembly Hall, a space whose architect had clearly been given conflicting instructions about whether to prioritize acoustics or intimidation, and had somehow managed to fail at both. The seating arrangement in the hall represented another layer of the status hierarchy, with the most influential species positioned closer to the center. The human delegation found themselves in the outermost ring, wedged between a silicon-based intelligence whose processing cycles were so slow that an entire conversation could occur between its words, and a hive consciousness whose members kept disassembling and reassembling throughout the proceedings. First orator Zuktral ascended to the central podium, his 7 speaking orifices pulsating in ceremonial rhythm. "Distinguished representatives of the galactic community, we gather to address matters of mutual concern and interest. Foremost among them, the question of Nexus 4 and its remarkable discoveries." What followed was a 3-hour overview of the situation that could have been summarized in 10 minutes by any species with a reasonable approach to concision. The humans maintained expressions of polite interest that occasionally slipped into what keen observers might identify as strategic microsleeps. Brief naps taken with eyes partially open, a skill reportedly taught in their diplomatic academy. Finally, the preliminary formalities concluded, and the real discussions began. A holographic representation of Nexus 4 appeared above the central podium, rotating slowly to display the contested territories and the location of the ruins. As you can see, explained the Archivist Guild representative, a being composed primarily of crystalline data structures, the ruins extend far beyond the initial discovery site. Preliminary scans indicate at least 17 interconnected chambers beneath the polar ice cap, all bearing extensive inscriptions in the unidentified language. Images of the inscriptions replace the planetary map, flowing symbols carved with impossible precision into surfaces that showed no tool marks. The characters seemed to shift subtly as one looked at them, creating the unsettling impression that they were alive in some fundamental way. Despite our most sophisticated linguistic analysis, continued the archivist, we have been unable to establish even basic phonetic or semantic patterns. The language appears to operate on principles entirely outside our understanding of communication. Perhaps, suggested a Kreshnar diplomat, with the special tone reserved for devastating condescension, we should consider the possibility that these are not language symbols at all, but merely decorative patterns. Some species, particularly those at earlier developmental stages, here a pointed glance toward the human delegation, often mistake aesthetics for communication. The older human with the wild hair shifted forward slightly in their seat, eyes narrowing as they studied the projected symbols with sudden intensity. Their gnarled fingers opened the ancient book they carried, pages rustling as they searched for something with unexpected urgency. The symbols contain internal consistencies that strongly suggest linguistic function, countered the archivist. We've identified recurring elements that appear to modify other elements in systematic ways. The challenge is that the underlying logic doesn't match any known language family. Has anyone attempted verbal reconstruction? Asked the older human abruptly, their voice cutting through the subsequent discussion. The assembly turned toward the human section with expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance at the interruption. Verbal reconstruction? Repeated the archivist, crystalline form flickering slightly in what might have been confusion. Yes, continued the human, seemingly oblivious to the breach of protocol. These symbols may represent sounds rather than concepts. Has anyone attempted to pronounce them based on structural analysis? A moment of silence fell over the assembly, followed by what the translators rendered as varying degrees of derisive amusement. A charming suggestion, said a senior Kreshnar diplomat finally, but perhaps reflecting a fundamental misunderstanding of advanced linguistic principles. These symbols exist in patterns of such mathematical complexity that reducing them to crude vocalizations would be akin to describing a supernova as a bright light. Besides, added another delegate, even if such an approach had merit, I doubt human vocal apparatus would be capable of the necessary range. Your species can barely manage two-dimensional phonetics, let alone the multispectral articulations these would likely require. The older human nodded politely, accepting the dismissal with the practiced grace of someone who had weathered far worse condescension. But those close enough might have noticed a curious gleam in their eyes, the look of someone who has just confirmed a long-held theory and is calculating exactly how much chaos its revelation will cause. As the first day's session drew to a close, most delegations departed with the satisfied exhaustion of those who had accomplished nothing but had done so with great ceremony. The human group lingered, huddled in quiet conversation that occasionally drew curious glances from passing diplomats. Did you see it? The older human was asking, finger tracing patterns in their ancient book. Are you certain? Replied the lead negotiator, voice carefully neutral. Not completely, but certain enough to try. Tomorrow then, nodded the negotiator, when they present the primary inscription. As they finally left the hall, a cleaning drone nudged the book that the older human had accidentally left open on their seat. The drone's basic visual recognition software registered incomprehensible symbols on yellowed pages, strange characters that bore an uncanny resemblance to the mysterious inscriptions that had baffled the greatest minds in the galaxy. The drone, programmed only for maintenance and lacking the capacity for astonishment, simply closed the book and placed it in the lost and found repository, unaware that it had just handled the key to a revelation that would upend the galactic order in less than 24 hours. The second day of the summit began with the traditional ceremony of renewed diplomatic intent, a ritual whose primary function appeared to be ensuring no substantive discussions could occur until mid-afternoon. Meanwhile, in the human quarters adjacent to the waste reclamation system, an intense debate was unfolding. Are you absolutely certain? The chief negotiator asked for perhaps the 17th time. The older humans, surrounded by displays showing the mysterious inscriptions, tapped their ancient book with a gnarled finger. As certain as one can be without confirmation, the structural similarities are unmistakable. And you can actually read it? Read it, yes. Pronounce it correctly? That's more complicated. Phonetic drift over thousands of years makes exact pronunciation speculative. But it should be close enough. After further debate about the diplomatic risks, the chief negotiator made the decision. We proceed, but follow the exact protocol we discussed. No improvisations. The older human's eyes twinkled with mischief. Crystal. Nobody believed them for a nanosecond. The afternoon session featured a presentation on the primary inscription chamber within the Nexus 4 ruins. The holographic display showed a vast underground hall covered in flowing symbols that seemed to pulse with internal rhythm despite being carved into stone. The central chamber appears to be some form of knowledge repository, explained the lead archaeologist. The inscription density suggests information equivalent to approximately 1 exabyte in current data storage terms. The archaeologist focused on a distinct central panel. The structural pattern suggests this may be an introduction or guide, perhaps even a key to deciphering the language itself. Has there been any progress in translation? Asked a representative. Minimal, the archaeologist admitted. We've identified numerical sequences based on mathematical constants, but beyond that, the language remains opaque. As diplomats began maneuvering to restrict access to the ruins, the older human interrupted. May I ask a question? After reluctant acknowledgement, they stood. Has anyone attempted to read the central panel aloud? As explained yesterday, replied the Kreshnar linguist with exaggerated patience. Vocalizing visual symbols without established phonetic understanding is not a recognized translational approach. So that's a no then? Persisted the human. After some debate about scientific methodology, the assembly permitted a brief demonstration. The holographic display shifted to show the central panel in its raw form, flowing symbols that seemed to shimmer as if alive. The older humans studied them, occasionally glancing at their ancient book, then began to speak. The sounds that emerged were unlike anything most delegates had heard from a human, flowing melodic syllables, interspersed with precise glottal stops and resonant tones that vibrated at multiple frequencies. For 8 seconds, stunned silence reigned. Then 3 things happened in rapid succession. Every translation device simultaneously malfunctioned. A section of the holographic inscription began to glow with an inner light. A deep rumbling voice emerged from the holographic system, bypassing the malfunctioning translators. Archive access protocol initiated, linguistic pattern recognized, early colonial Earth standard, variant 7. Welcome, descendants, access granted. Chaos erupted. Delegates leapt to their feet in disbelief. The holographic voice continued. Would you like to proceed with general archive access or specific information retrieval? The older human responded in the same flowing language, presumably requesting standby mode, as the voice fell silent while the inscription continued to glow. First Orator Ziktral finally restored order. Explain, immediately. The older human smiled, the particular smile of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated. The untranslatable language is actually a variant of an ancient human language family, specifically Proto-Indo-European with influences from Sanskrit and Vedic traditions. Impossible, declared the Kreshnar linguist. Your species wasn't even using stone tools when these ruins were created. And yet, replied the human, gesturing toward the glowing inscription, the evidence suggests otherwise. Are you claiming, asked Ziktral, barely containing his disbelief, that humans are somehow connected to the precursors? I'm not claiming anything definitive yet, but the linguistic evidence suggests at minimum a shared language base. As the initial shock faded, the political implications crystallized. If humans could access the precursor archive when no other species could, the balance of power throughout the galaxy would shift dramatically. The human delegation departed under the suddenly watchful eyes of security drones that had previously ignored them. They walked with measured dignity, a restraint that observers noted with growing unease. A species smart enough to decipher the precursor language, yet wise enough not to immediately flaunt their advantage, might be more dangerous than anyone had previously considered. The emergency session convened 3 hours later resembled a funeral for the old galactic order. Species that had smugly occupied the upper echelons of diplomatic hierarchy now huddled in anxious consultation, while the human delegation suddenly relocated to premium quarters with a conspicuous absence of waste reclamation background noise, sat in uncharacteristic silence. First orator Trail, visibly struggling to maintain composure, addressed the assembly. In light of recent developments, we must reassess our approach to Nexus 4. The understatement triggered several translation devices to display sarcasm warnings. The human delegation has expressed willingness to facilitate access to the archives, continued Trell, each word extracted as if through painful dental surgery. They have proposed a collaborative research initiative with proportional representation from all interested parties. What he didn't mention, what everyone knew, was that proportional now meant humans first, everyone else fighting for scraps. The power dynamics had inverted so dramatically that several species representatives were experiencing actual physiological symptoms of status shock. The older humans stood, their wild hair now seeming less eccentric and more like the mark of someone touched by ancient wisdom. We have no desire to monopolize this discovery. Knowledge should illuminate all paths, not just a privileged few. The philosophical platitude, so recently the domain of condescending senior diplomats, now emerged from human lips with the weight of unexpected authority. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own patronizing tones reflected back at them. However, continued the human with calculated precision, practical considerations require a structured approach. The archive appears to respond only to specific linguistic patterns within the human vocal range. We will need to establish protocols for access requests and information dissemination. Translation, humans would control the tap, determining what knowledge flowed and to whom. The Kreshinar senior diplomat, desperate to salvage something from the catastrophe, raised a three-fingered appendage. We propose forming an oversight committee to ensure equitable distribution of discoveries. An excellent suggestion, agreed the human chief negotiator, with a diplomatic smile that didn't quite hide the gleam of triumph. And naturally, membership would be based on demonstrated relevant expertise. The deliberate echo of the very criteria previously used to exclude humans from meaningful participation wasn't lost on anyone. Several delegates flinched visibly as the session concluded with preliminary agreements on research protocols, all fundamentally dependent on human linguistic access. The gallery observers noted a remarkable restraint from the human delegation. No gloating, no excessive demands. Just a quiet confidence that somehow made their victory even more unsettling. In the diplomatic lounges afterward, a Cleridian philosopher summed up the general sentiment. The truly frightening thing isn't that they can speak to the ancients. It's that they've endured centuries of our condescension without once revealing this connection. What else might they be hiding? The question hung in the recycled air of Concordia Station like an undetonated explosive. Meanwhile, in their new premium quarters, the human delegation reviewed preliminary data from the archives, information that would revolutionize a dozen scientific fields overnight. The older human, finally relaxing after the performance of a lifetime, allowed themselves a smile. Funny, isn't it? They mused. All those species so convinced of their superiority, never noticing the pattern. The primitive humans who somehow kept showing up in places they shouldn't, surviving things they shouldn't, understanding things they shouldn't. The chief negotiator nodded. They were so busy looking down, they never thought to look back to where we came from, or who we might truly be, added the older human, their fingers tracing ancient symbols that had waited millennia to be spoken again by the descendants of those who carved them among the stars. The irony was exquisite. The most primitive species turned out to have the oldest linguistic roots, a revelation that would rewrite not just history books, but the very foundation of galactic civilization.